Okay, so welcome. Really happy to have you both here with us, and welcome to the global community who's joined us by the power of technology. My name's Pamela Fuselli. I lead Parachute, which is Canada's national injury prevention charity. So just go over the format for today. We are going to have a discussion with the panelists, followed by a question and answer segment. Many of the participants have submitted questions already, but if you do have a question during our discussion, if something comes up, you can use the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen to send your questions. So I will try to get to as many as possible. We only do have an hour. So I am going to turn it over to Lottie, who is going to give a few a few comments from the Alliance.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Lotte Brøndum. I'm the head of the Global Alliance of NGOs for Road Safety. And good morning and good afternoon from all corners of the world here. I'm in Europe, so I've been up for a longer time here. I just wanted to give you just a little bit of kicking off the discussion today. So we have had a number of calls with our more than 240 members, non-governmental organizations in 90 countries, talking about how they're managing and coping here during the COVID-19 crisis. And some of the things that they talked about was how they have seen empty streets, and they have seen streets being cleared for walking and biking, and reduction of congestion. And these are changes that we in the road safety community have advocated for a very, very long time. And these are also issues under the Sustainable Development Goals, and these are issues that many other groups are also working on. So one of the things that we wanted to touch on today in today's discussion is how do we keep all these good things that have come from this global situation. And also, there are a lot of groups out there who are potentially partners. And how do we connect with them? How do we address the issues that this crisis have put us in? So over the next couple of weeks, we will run a couple of these Alliance live sessions. And today's one we have called COVID-19, Safer Roads and Urban Planning. And Pam already introduced herself. She's an Alliance member from Parachute in Canada.
Oops. Sorry, we lost
Lottie.
Where is she?
I'm still hearing.
I was muted. That was
me. Go ahead. Sorry, technology. Go ahead, Lottie.
Thank you very much. I'm here back. So I just wanted to thank you, Jennifer and Oliver, for being with us and talking to us about what we can learn from urban planning and how we can connect the dots with safer roads and urban planning and what we have seen during the past couple of weeks. And Pam, back to you, and thank you very much for moderating the session today.
Thank you, Lottie. And sorry for muting you there. Okay, so yeah, as Lottie said, you know, COVID-19, this pandemic has changed the way that we're seeing our streets and urban spaces used. And so today, our two panelists here have addressed these issues over the past several weeks, but prior to that, both of you have been champions for actions that improve road safety, increase physical modes of transportation, and draw attention to issues of equity that underlie all of those. And you guys continue to be champions. And so Very pleased to have Jennifer Keesmaat, who is an urban planner passionate about creating spaces where people flourish. Named one of the most powerful people in Canada by Maclean's, one of the most influential by Toronto Life, and one of the top women of influence in Canada, she spent 5 years as Toronto's chief city planner, where she was celebrated for her forward-thinking and collaborative approach to city building. And also joining us, Oliver Moore, who joined the Globe and Mail's newsroom in 2000 and has spent the last 7 years reporting on urban issues. For most of that time, he wrote about urban transportation, including investigations into and sustained coverage of pedestrian safety that helped make the issue a political priority at Toronto City Hall. For the last year, his job has expanded to include urban affairs more broadly, while still allowing him to write about how we can move safely through cities. So lately we've heard phrases about, the magic of empty streets. We've seen clean and clear air in places like Los Angeles, Beijing, Delhi, and in places animals have returned to city spaces. In particular, debates have surfaced on the benefits of expanding the space that pedestrians and cyclists could now occupy now that traffic volumes are down. But what does it all mean for the future? Is this just a short-term phenomenon? How can the positive outcomes of this pandemic, the decrease in deaths and injuries on our roads, the reduction of air pollution, the increase in society's consciousness of the importance of prevention, of access to outdoor space, and the thrill of using walking and cycling as modes of travel be continued? So life is going to look very different after this crisis is over, or is it? What is the path forward to make positive changes? So Jennifer and Oliver, I'll give you each a few minutes to make some initial comments. Jennifer, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you, Pamela, and thank you for having me in this global conversation, and hello to everyone around the world. It's wonderful to be chatting with you this morning. In Toronto, it's early in the morning, so we're fresh. Some of you may have a latte, some of you may have a glass of wine in your hand, depending on the time of day. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. What I'd like to say in my introductory comments is that I think there's 3 key things for us to think about as we think about what happens next. And the first thing is that whatever happens next is a choice. There's a lot of conversation about whether or not the world will look one way or whether the world will look another way. And what I find kind of bizarre about that is it presupposes like we're on a predetermined path for a future. And in fact, our cities have always been a choice. They are an outcome of a whole variety of choices that we make every day when we're budgeting, when we're designing our streets, when we're designing our neighborhoods. And our cities will continue to be a choice. And the question really is, will we choose to keep things the same, or will we choose to transform our cities? And that really leads me into the second point that I would like to highlight, which is the opportunity for acceleration. So in some sectors, we've seen this phenomenal acceleration of economic policy, for example. We've seen countries like Spain accelerate towards a universal basic income, putting that in place and putting the mechanisms in place, saying that a universal basic income will in fact be the foundation of the economy moving forward. This is something in America that has been discussed for many years. Andrew Yang made it the center of his campaign platform. All of a sudden, we see almost like a testing of measures, universal basic income being embraced in places where before it was largely ignored. During the primaries, Andrew Yang's idea wasn't discussed very much, and he dropped out of the primaries. And now, of course, it's something that's being discussed quite widely. We've been inching towards a universal basic income in the Canadian context. I use that as an example to demonstrate that this is a moment, if we choose, where we can accelerate towards a fundamentally different kind of future. And of course, the same for our cities. It's exactly the same for our streets. It's exactly the same for whether we create equitable communities or communities that still continue to accelerate the conglomeration of wealth and the concentration of poverty, which has been happening, believe it or not, in my city for over 20 years, which is a very wealthy city. But we've been seeing as the wealthy in our city have been getting wealthier, we've also been seeing that the poor are getting poorer, and the number of people that live below the poverty line has been increasing. City design and mobility are critical parts of how we actually create sustainable cities. And I mean socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, fiscally sustainable. And so we have a choice, and we can accelerate towards a vision that delivers on a fundamentally more just and more humane city. Or we can keep things the same, or even worse, we could step back. We could retract. And that leads me to the third comment I would like to make, which is about density. Because there's been, in some circles, depending on where you are in the world, there's been some conversations that density is the problem. Now, disease has always shaped cities. That's not something that is new. We have public health systems precisely because of disease in cities and figuring out ways to mitigate disease. Now, we also know that when we look at the response to this pandemic, that places like Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Taiwan, incredibly dense places, had a tremendous amount of preparedness and sophisticated systems of response that have led to very, very positive outcomes. Even though there's some rebounding that's happening right now, we can expect that in other cities as well. Initially, very, very positive responses. There's a clue there about density, that density isn't a problem, that our systems, our public health care, our compliance with government and government regulation is more of a factor in determining whether or not we will see the proliferation of disease and viruses in dense cities in the future. I raise this because there's a risk. When we talk about the choice, there's a risk that we see dense cities as a result of this pandemic as being a problem. And I just want to stress how much this is a risk. It's a risk because if we care about active transportation, if we care about safe streets, we must then consider very deeply the opportunity of communities that are primarily walkable and transit oriented. And the only way we can deliver on communities that are primarily walkable and cycling and transit oriented is to ensure that we're getting our density right. So when we talk about the choice we face in this moment in history, probably the greatest risk that we face right now is that there will be an illogical, irrational, and unproven backlash to density, when in fact, density can accelerate all of our sustainable development goals. We know that density is essential to deliver cities where wildlife flourishes, where our air is clean, where our water is clean. All those things we need to create humane cities is really rooted in density. And so we've got to get that choice right. The risk before us is that we maybe accelerate, but we accelerate in the wrong direction, or we become reactionary. And if we want walkable, transit-oriented, cycling-oriented, safe cities where we can continue to live in a 15-minute neighborhood and not have to buy into the long commute, which is damaging in so many different ways, we cannot give up on density, and we must not fall prey to some kind of reactionism around density as being linked to the problem that we see today in this pandemic. I'll pause there. We can pick up on some of those themes in our conversation, but I just want to say that from my perspective, in terms of laying the foundation to this conversation, it really starts with those three things. It starts with knowing that we have a choice. The future is not determined. It's a very empowering idea in a moment when many of us feel powerless. Secondly, we have an opportunity for acceleration. I used the example of universal basic income, but we could accelerate in the wrong way. And that means we need to consider very carefully the importance of density to walking and cycling and active transportation cities.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. Oliver, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Pamela. I'll keep this very brief to give as much time for questions as I can. As you mentioned, I write about city issues for the Globe and Mail. It's a national broadsheet based out of Toronto, and I've been doing that for a number of years. And it's a very interesting time for me, and I think for everyone who lives in cities, because although individually many of us are tense and concerned, and quite understandably in many cases we are frightened, it's also an exciting time for cities because this is a time when change can happen. And Jennifer reflected at this, certainly. It's a change that we don't know what it's going to look like, but I think it's fairly clear that there's a before and after of this in this pandemic. Will we go back to how we were before? That seems unlikely, but what we will go to, as Jennifer said, is an unwritten book, or whatever the phrase was you just used. And luckily, that everyone who's on this call, you are some of the people who will help make those decisions. So I'm really glad to be here today and to have this conversation. I sit here in all humility saying that everything I say may prove to be wrong, because 3 months ago, I did not in any way imagine I was going to be sitting in this position talking about this today. So we will see what we will see, but I think it's a very important conversation, and I'm glad to be here today to be joined by people around the world.
Great, thanks so much, Oliver. So let's talk about the first question that we had around, and you've kind of touched a little bit on it, and I'll open it up to either of you, and we can go from there. Very relaxed. There's no sort of formal framework for this, but so communities, both the citizens, I think, government, you see corporations, NGOs, all of us on the line, we're all learning about the different things as through this pandemic, through the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think one of the major themes that I've been seeing is the interconnectedness, and Jennifer, you touched on this when you talked about the density, is I think people have thought about transportation, health, the economy in silos, equity, poverty and things like that in silos, some interconnectedness. But I think one of the things that this pandemic has shown us is how interconnected all of these things are. So what are some of the lessons that we might be able to learn that can inform some of those choices as we go forward?
Do you want to start, Jennifer?
Sure, I can start. I think that's really a critical point, the interconnectedness, in part because I think that the big challenge that we've had in cities is that we haven't been able to connect things like planning primarily around cars and obesity, or planning primarily around cars and social equity issues. And in fact, there have often been some almost incomprehensible misconnections that have been made. For example, the idea that road tolls is somehow a problem from a social justice perspective, as opposed to the opposite being true. So I think there's an opportunity in this moment in history to actually figure out a broader narrative for cities that actually places cities in it's almost like a logic for cities that has been missing. And we've been fighting over the logic of cities. And I do think, and I'm not just playing to my audience here, I do think it comes down to roads and road safety. 25% of the surface area in most cities in the world is roads. Most cities of the world, maintaining those roads is the most expensive part of the municipal budget, repairing them, rebuilding them. In most cities in the world, it's on the roads that most people are likely to die. That's the odds. You're going to die on the road, either as a pedestrian, in a vehicle. So if you look at all of these issues, whether it's public health, whether it's public safety, whether it's the allocation of municipal resources, all of them actually come together around how we think about and how we design our roads. It's a hook that you can hang a much bigger vision for the city on if we get it right. And there's this question, and I do really think it's a choice, which is why I started with that. Are we going to accelerate into a vision that is more cohesive, Or are we going to continue to have this battle in our cities over how we use space that is really materialized in the design and the maintenance of our road infrastructure? And the good thing is, I think because of COVID-19, because these connections have been being made in real time and place. And I'll give you an example. For a couple of years now, I've been doing a tremendous amount of work on housing and key worker housing in cities, workforce housing. And that work is focused on the risk to cities if the people who live in the city and make the city function, the key workers, whether it's frontline healthcare workers or teachers or young tech entrepreneurs or people in the service industry, if they're forced into a long commute outside of the city, or if they're forced to live somewhere else, what a risk that is to the overall thriving of the city. Well, 3 months ago, a lot of people would still go, key workers, I don't know what you're talking about. Aren't we all important? I think today, people really get who key workers are, because key workers are the people that are serving us every day right now and keeping the rest of us alive, quite frankly. So whereas 3 months ago, that was a hard concept. It was something that often, people were like, maybe important, maybe not. Today, people go, oh yeah, I get it. I really get it. I thought I was important, but now I really realize who the people are who keep this city going, including the garbage collectors and including the public health officials who have not really had a place of status in our society, but who in this moment in time, we're deeply reliant on for our survival. So I think because the connections are being made and laid bare in an accelerated way, it presents an opportunity for us to create that cohesive vision for the city moving forward that people can kind of buy into. Oliver, I'm interested to hear your comments on some of those ideas as well.
Well, I think the question of the interconnectedness is interesting, especially when you think about equity, because one of the issues that's certainly come up a lot in Toronto is about the use of public space during this pandemic. And I think there are quite reasonable and solid rules on not being close to each other. But what is laid bare is a real divide in this city and in many cities between those who have their own personal space and those who do not. You've got about half of the people in Toronto live in a home, a house that is, and about half live in multi-residential apartments. Now, it's one thing to say, stay home if you have a 3-story house and a backyard and a front yard. It's not easy, but it's easier than if you live in a 500 square foot apartment building which has no balcony and doesn't even have a window that opens. For people like that, the outdoors is their space. They need that space. And I think that's becoming more and more clear during this time, because we're having these debates about should people be in parks and how should they be in parks. I think it's becoming more evident that the park space is not a frivolous thing. It's an important part of these people's lives, and it's an important part of the city's life. And so I think that we're seeing a little bit, you talked, Jennifer, about how we're seeing it's becoming more clear who is important and who is an essential worker. I think it's also becoming more clear the value of public space, which, I've been writing about this for years, and Jennifer, as a chief planner, you've thought about this for years in your former job and in your current one. But often it's activists who are kind of shouting in the wind about public space, and they don't get a lot of attention. And in spite of the fact that it's a very important issue, I think now it's getting some more attention, and maybe we'll see some change on it.
Well, I'll take that even one step further. So 17% of the land area in Toronto is the ravine strategy. And the argument that I made as chief planner is that you can't add density to the city without also protecting public space, both as environmental systems that support human life, but also as an amenity for people who are accepting and embracing a much more urban form of living. Now, we made that ravine strategy almost 5 years ago now, and of course it never got funded. So I would go a step further. I don't think it was just activists. The politicians actually didn't have constituencies that were advocating for that public space, and hopefully those constituencies will be more empowered to advocate for that space. But I'm actually hopeful that this moment will lay bare some of those connections that we've made in our public policy, which is the connection between urban living and excellent public spaces. And that it will become clear to the politicians, because I do think that's been a really critical part of the problem here. And we sort of offered a promise, which was you can trade off private space for public space in dense urban living. That's a promise that we made. We make that promise in public policy. But the minute this pandemic hit, what happened? The government started closing public spaces, which is actually breaking a social contract, despite the fact that people have actually been exceptional in embracing social distancing. So, you know, breaking that social contract with the public, I think is a very big risk that when I look at the framework that I've laid out in terms of choice, acceleration, and density, my fear is that we accelerate the wrong way, that we accelerate against density, because a decision to close parks is, in fact, the opposite of the direction that we should be going. And protecting roadways for cars, even though the cars are empty, that's actually an acceleration in the wrong way.
I suspect we'll get to this in a later question, but you know, the question of walking space is huge in Toronto, and it's huge in just about every city I'm aware of. I mean, a few weeks ago, Dan Rather, of all people, tweeted, maybe at the end of this, we'll all have wider sidewalks or something to that effect. You know, is it viable in long term in a place like Toronto or any city, frankly, to have sidewalks that are 2 meters wide? I mean, a year ago this week, there was 2 years ago this week, there was a van attack. A person driving a van went up on the sidewalk and killed a number of pedestrians in North Toronto. And that really clarified the attention of a lot of people for a certain kind of danger that hadn't really been thought about before. We'd seen other such attacks, but it clarified sort of the political reality of such a danger. I think now we're arguably in a place where we're starting to realize that pedestrians can actually be a danger to each other. And how does the city manage that? How does the city manage that when the infrastructure is not built for it?
Yeah, both of you have traveled quite extensively. And as you say, you know, there's a lot of armchair opinions right now that we're seeing. Rather being one of them, he may be one of the more well-informed. But in terms of, you know, what us as NGOs need to hear about what solutions really work around safety on the roads, what changes internationally have you seen that you think might be models of what we might make choices to move towards in the future? Oliver, I know you just came back from a big trip, right?
Yeah, why don't I start with that? I mean, one thing that's been super controversial in a lot of cities, though there has been movement in now, I think, well over 100 cities, is this idea of opening up some road space to pedestrians and cyclists, or to frame it a different way, to, you know, sort of close it to cars. And it depends on your framing. The argument to some extent depends on the framing. That has not happened in some cities, and the argument in those cities typically has been, we're worried that it would send a message that people should go outside and that people may congregate in these areas. I've so far not seen evidence of that in the cities that have done this in a broad-based way. You know, if you open a single 1 kilometer stretch of a road somewhere in your city, that may become a destination. If you do what Oakland is doing, opening, I think, about 120 kilometers of slow streets, or I think New York City Council is trying to push through a bill over the objections of the mayor to do, I think, 75 miles, that seems much less likely to create that sort of potential for congregation. I don't know if it would happen, but it seems less likely to happen if you have more space, more of these spaces.
Yeah, Jennifer,
So
you talked about the you know, the public space and that. What have you seen that has worked in other countries that we might be able to, that we all may be able to learn from?
So I have a little bit of a different view. So I think, first of all, we need to differentiate between 3 time frames. There's right now, which for many of us is the lockdown phase or the self-quarantine phase and the social distancing phase. There's right now. Then there's the in-between, which is when we're going to begin transitioning to whatever the new normal looks like. So there's that phase. And then there's the third phase, which I will call after, and it's after the pandemic. And it could be that the in-between stage goes on for a couple of years, or the in-between stage goes on between when we get out of lockdown, but we don't yet have a vaccine. And the after phase, I think of as being after the vaccine. And so when we talk about solutions and how we use our city, those are 3 distinct phases that have different challenges. And we need to think about our roads in terms of those challenges, I think in different ways. Like what we're facing right now is going to be very different from the in-between when we're going back to work, when our restaurants are open again. This is, you know, in the North American context or the Canadian context. And then the after phase when people have a vaccine. And all three phases, I should say, ought to be different than the way things were before. There's no situation, I agree with Oliver on this, where we go back to being what we were. Because what we were had so many problems, which is why Parachute exists, why all these NGOs exist. We know that we had a problem with the way our roads were being used in our cities. So let's not go back there. Let's use this moment to accelerate to something better. So in terms of the right now phase, I would honestly say it should be different in different cities and even in different neighborhoods. So for example, some neighborhoods that are very, very suburban, where there isn't a lot of density, you don't really need to do anything other than create social license for people to take the street and walk down the middle of the street in order to maintain social distance. The traffic volumes are so low. And I tried to get a hashtag going called Take the Street. The traffic volumes are so low that there's no reason why people can't walk down the middle of the street in suburban low density contexts. That's a very easy fix. You don't have to build anything. You don't have to design anything. You don't have to put up a sign. You just need your mayors and civic leaders to say, if you live in a neighborhood with these characteristics, please walk on the street, take the street. We're giving you license to do that. So that's one type of setting in the now scenario. Another setting in the now scenario is where you actually have quite a bit of density and you have narrow sidewalks and you have multiple lanes and you don't need to close the road. You just need to take a lane. So don't take the street, but take a lane. And this is something that we've seen in many cities where just a lane has been allocated. Boston has done this recently. A lane has been allocated. You can use pylons, you can use other temporary infrastructure. Berlin has done this as well, where cars can still go, but there's a much lower volume of cars. You don't need all 4 lanes or 6 lanes or whatever it is. Just give over 1 lane and really consider that a social distancing lane. That's a lane that allows people to make a wider berth when they're passing, or if there starts to be a little bit of a crowd, people have that space on the road that has been allocated in order for them to maintain social distancing, which always is the objective in all of these scenarios. And then the third scenario, which is really what Oakland has done, Oakland has closed 74 miles of streets where they basically made those streets no longer accessible to cars. It's the most extreme measure. It might be necessary in some areas where you had a high volume of cars and now you've got a high volume of pedestrians or cyclists. What I like about it is if you can do it in a networked way, you can actually create a fabulous environment for people to get out and bike. And we need people to be able to get outside, and they can do that safely. It's also the most extreme measure in some ways, because you're basically saying you can't drive here at all other than local traffic. And I think there's probably very few spaces in the city where you need to do that. I think number one that I mentioned, which is in areas where you've got a higher volume of pedestrians and cyclists, turn every street into a shared street. And leaders can just do this by saying it. They can say, hey, from now on, the streets in these neighborhoods are all shared streets. Expect cyclists, expect pedestrians going down the middle of the street, and drive slowly. Because through policy, we're shifting the priority. We're not redesigning anything. Through policy, we're giving the priority to cycling and walking. And if you're in a car, go slowly. You could even go so far as to put temporary lower speed limits. Those are kind of all my suggestions for the now. We can talk some more about the in-between and the after, but those are my suggestions for the now period.
I would jump in though on something you said there. I mean, I can see why political leaders are loath to do the suggestion about the shared street, because as you said, you stressed drive slowly. I'm not sure, if I was a politician, I'm not sure I would be confident that people would heed that drive slowly message, because what we have seen in many cities, including in Toronto, is that the reduction in traffic has led to a great increase in speeding. Toronto police say speeding is up dramatically. Stunt driving, which under Ontario law is defined as going more than 50 kilometers over the limit, is up dramatically. You know, the Ontario Highway Police say they're impounding 10 cars a day for stunt driving. This is not all drivers by any means, but some drivers, when faced with a wide open road, are instinctively going a lot faster. And so I think encouraging people to walk on the streets, effectively say be a vehicular pedestrian, I can see some politicians being very nervous about that.
Yeah. Well, I would just counter that, Oliver, by saying that I don't think any of those so-called stunt drivers are driving quickly because they're trying to hit someone. I think that's a once in 100-year scenario, and that person is a terrorist. I don't think those people are terrorists. I think they're driving quickly because they have a wide open road. The clue the infrastructure is giving them is drive quickly. And what we need to do is shift the clues. If you see children cycling on the street, you don't step on the pedal, you slow down. So in the other piece, I'll just add to that, if that's an issue, then enforcement's an issue. But generally, having people on the street tends to slow people down. We've seen that evidence in European countries that have embraced shared streets. They see the shared streets have lower traffic fatalities than streets where you're relying on signage for people to do the right thing. So that right there is a very powerful clue that in practice that simply isn't true. The second piece is that at the end of the day, I don't understand this argument that, oh, but we can't trust drivers. We're trusting everybody right now. Civil society is based on trust. We go out of our homes on the assumption that we're going to walk 6 meters apart because we're trusting that people will do that. And if we say we're not going to trust anyone to do anything right, then lock us down in our homes. Don't let anyone outside.
Don't encourage anyone, please.
Well, but my point is, I think that leads to this idea that we can't trust people. We're only talking about drivers, but we have to trust everyone right now. And from what I've seen in my neighborhood, from what I've seen from my colleagues around the world, there has been an astounding level of compliance with social distancing. Astounding. So we should expect that of drivers as well. I think drivers are the rest of us, right?
And that may actually be, as you say, the not policy, but or a lot of signage or a lot of expense. We're seeing places like New York that has reduced their road safety efforts by $24 million in order to be able to fund COVID-19 expenses. So, we're seeing, in Toronto, the automated speed enforcement initiative has been suspended for the time. So we're seeing some of the impacts financially on decisions around road safety. So how can those of us in the NGO community work with the media, with urban planners, with planning advocates to ensure that either that funding, if it's necessary, comes back, or that we are moving ahead with some of those ideas around what happens post, that we don't go back, but it's a path forward?
Well, I think if I could jump in first, I think it would be a terrible irony if traffic deaths went up as a result of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. There's an anecdote in one of Bill Bryson's books where he talks about in the early months of the Blitz, during the blackout periods, there was a huge increase in pedestrians being hit by drivers. And in fact, more pedestrians were hit by British drivers in the early parts of the Blitz than people were killed by falling bombs. It would be a terrible thing if in this pandemic, we actually had deaths not only due to COVID-19, but also increased deaths on the road. And I think that let me put it this way. A number of people a month ago, when some people were still trying to downplay the pandemic, would say X number of people die in traffic collisions every year, and we don't stop our society for that. Why would we stop it for this pandemic? Perhaps the way is to turn that question around and say, look, if we're willing to go to these enormous lengths for this pandemic, maybe as a society, we should go to some lengths to reduce traffic collisions as well.
I think it's a very good question, and the idea globally, just even beyond road safety, around this consciousness around the effectiveness and the importance of prevention post COVID-19, I think gives us an opportunity to make some of those, not comparisons, but to put forward a case that says that, you know, there were very clear and effective measures that we put into place to prevent this disease. I think that these tools, if you apply them to prevention and road safety in particular, can be just as effective. And are we willing, and have we embraced the opportunities that we've had during this pandemic to, you know, get out, to walk more, to not take the car out, to see, I mean, the images of the places that are normally, you know, in fog, or, you know, the pollution of fog, and to see them so clear. I mean, people have really, it's raised their consciousness about what is possible. So, you know, I think that, you know, making those, again, going back to those connections and making those very purposefully, not assuming that people can make those connections in their own frame. You know, there's some opportunities as we come through this, I think. So Jennifer, from the urban planner perspective, you know, how can NGOs that are working on road safety partner with the planners, the people who are making those decisions for their particular cities or towns or countries?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that, related back to what Oliver was just talking about the magnitude of traffic deaths and pedestrian deaths, is that with respect to your question about costs, I think there's a really powerful role for the NGOs to play here in making it really clear that even if you don't care about human life, imagine, but if you don't, there's a cost associated with our road fatalities that is astronomical. And that cost is everything from police services to health services. There's a cost, if you wanted to be crass and just look at it from a purely financial lens, you would be investing in road safety. So I think there's a role for the NGOs to play in making that case. There was an organization in Canada that was promoting a carbon tax, and that organization was called the Eco-Fiscal Commission. And one of the things that the Eco-Fiscal Commission did so brilliantly was they collected a tremendous amount of data to show that there's an economic argument for mitigating climate change. Now, today that seems obvious, but they started this 5 years ago when in conservative circles, no one was talking that way. In fact, there was still a lot of denial at that point. And they brought together from across the political spectrum experts who were able to advocate for a carbon tax as being a critical economic development tool and not just an environmental tool. I think NGOs could do the same thing here on road safety, that there's an opportunity to bring together people from across the political spectrum who see how damaging road fatalities are just to the health and vitality of a city from a financial perspective. And again, all of us on the line right now see this in a much bigger way. We see it in terms of health. We see it in terms of social justice. We see it in terms of social equity. We see it in terms of cities for families and cities for people. But if you want to go back to that risk that money is going to come out of the road safety budget in this moment in history, and there's indications like New York that that's already happening, there has to be a counter voice that actually makes it really clear that if all you care about is where the money's going to come from, do something preventative and change your roads, because you're going to save money by doing so. And I don't think that argument has really been comprehensively made. Imagine that there was a global movement that actually made that argument. And I think one of the reasons why we don't do it is because it's really unsavory to do so. It's like really vile to actually say we're going to put road fatalities simply in an economic frame. But at this point, probably most of the people on this call, like Oliver, like me, we've been beating this drum for many, many years, and I don't actually really care as long as it's truthful. and it uses data and analysis, if that's what it takes to get a shift in how we think about our road infrastructure and how some of those more conservative politicians who just simply are not getting it, if that's what they need, if all they care about is balancing the budget, then let's show them this is good for balancing the budget.
And actually, that brings us back to the topic of interconnectedness. I mean, you talked earlier, Jennifer, about the density argument. And I frankly think that some of the people making the anti-density argument are people who've been making the anti-density argument for decades. And this is an excuse to make the anti-density argument again. And fair enough. But I think we also have to be reasonable and say, if you're saying that density is bad for health reasons, you have to also then look at the other side of the equation and say, if density is bad, more people will commute, and that also has health implications. You have to look at both.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked a bit, I mean, we've talked about the NGOs and the political sector and, you know, the government in terms of, you know, their policy making and that. There are private companies that we've seen that have taken a leadership role in this area. We work with Desjardins, for example, on our Vision Zero road safety strategy. Bloomberg Philanthropies has invested a huge amount of money into road safety, especially in low and middle income countries. Have you had any experience with either, you know, through your coverage, Oliver, through working with the city, Jennifer, with the private sector, with corporations working on road safety, and what potentially, other than, you know, obviously through their own platform and through some of their funding, they can contribute. But, you know, would you see a role for them in what you were just describing in terms of, you know, the engagement and the making the case in terms of road safety and its economic benefit, but also its social benefit?
Well, I'll just say something that's a tiny bit tangential, but I think it's relevant. When we proposed the King Street pilot in Toronto, which was about transitioning a road right-of-way that was extremely inefficient right through the heart of the Toronto, and it went right through the financial district, there is a streetcar on that road. And the streetcar didn't function at full capacity because the streetcar was always stuck behind the cars. And we came forward with a proposal through city planning to transform that road right of way to make it more efficient so that we could move more people on transit and to transition how we use the road. And it was very interesting to see that once we brought really good data into the conversation, we spent a year and a half collecting data in advance. And we were able to demonstrate that cars moved only 16% of the people in the corridor, but they took up 64% of the road right of way. Once we brought that data into the conversation, we were able to get the financial district BIA, which is one of the most powerful BIAs representing businesses in the financial district of Canada. In the beginning, they were kind of tepid. Like our first meetings with them, they were like, I don't know, we might get blowback from our, you know, corporate CEOs who drive to work every day and want to use King Street. But once we started bringing the data forward and they went out and they surveyed their membership, they realized that a tremendous number of people working in the financial district, of course, took transit, but they realized that there was an appetite for doing things that were in the broader public interest in the city. And so on that example, I think it's an example where even if we don't have businesses to the table at the outset, that there's an opportunity to build the case, to build the narrative, to build the logic and the rationale. And if we do that in a compelling way, I think most people, no matter what sector they sit in, they actually care, particularly if they're invested in the city in some way. They actually do care about the thriving of the city. And there's been a bit of a fight about what thriving in the city actually looks like. Is building an expressway the best way for the city to thrive? Some people are making that argument. We've got to explain why that's a really bad argument and why that'll just result in more cars in the downtown. So I think there is a battle of narrative going on in the city. And unless we build a really powerful narrative, we don't actually give some of our potential partners a tool to use in these conversations. And quite frankly, the automotive industry will dominate that narrative. So I think there's a role here to build out good data and analysis and to use that to drive forward a new narrative about the city. And right now, there's an openness to new narratives.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and this is maybe an unwelcome thing to say to everyone on the call who cares deeply about this issue, but road safety is not always the sexiest issue politically or in a media point of view. And politicians tend to listen to those who are talking the loudest. And so the more voices who are added, almost regardless of what the message is, the more people who are saying that road safety is important, the more companies saying road safety is important, the more things will happen at City Hall.
Actually, that leads into to some of the Q&As that we received, and maybe I'll move into that section, and maybe we can go through a couple of these questions in the last few minutes that we have. Oliver, so how do you just sort of gave me a nice segue into the first question that I have for you, is around how do we as the NGO community help get our message out through the media? What are some things that we need to think about when we're approaching the media with this issue or with a story that we want to get out?
Well, it's a difficult question in a lot of ways, and particularly now because the media is overwhelmingly focused on the pandemic for obvious reasons. I think it's been 40 plus days since I've written a story that's not about the pandemic. That said, other issues continue to be important. And so what in the short to medium term might be the most important or the most useful approach is somehow try to tie it to the pandemic. So you've got a story that's a road safety issue story, but is also a pandemic story, which may help it find traction in the media nowadays.
It's good. And I think I think when people first think about road safety and COVID, they don't think about them connecting at all. And there's several issues around in prevention that we have found that there is a real connection, and it's a good time to start to make those intersections and the interrelated storyline to it.
Well, certainly, so if I could just jump in on that actually, because one example would be, there have been some calls in some cities to shut down transit because of the pandemic. And you could write a very interesting story about the pros and cons of that argument, but there's a road safety angle to an argument about shutting down transit. If you shut down transit, more people will be driving. What does that mean for the city? What does that mean for health? And so I think there are ways to tie a lot of things into road safety if you're a little bit creative as an NGO. Right.
And that actually leads. You're very good at this. I actually didn't share this question with you guys before this, but you have a nice segue in here. I think this idea of active mobility, that active transportation, is important. But I have started to hear, as we talk about, the first phase of getting back to, people not under lockdown or isolation, is that there may be a fear that getting back on transit that's very busy and people are in close proximity to each other may foster, sort of reaffirm that automobile culture. Jennifer, maybe you could comment on that issue.
I think that's a real risk. And if we go back to that framework that I talked about in terms of choices, there's the now, right now. None of us should be getting on transit unless we're an essential worker. Then there's the in-between phase, which is we're working again away from home, we're reintegrated, but we don't have a vaccine yet. And then there's the after phase when we have the vaccine. And I think all three of those phases need to be treated differently. The in-between phase, we're still going to be social distancing. So we're going to be staying in our neighborhoods more. We're going to be using transit less. We're going to need, one of the first things that a lot of transit agencies did was cut bus service. But we might actually need higher levels of service so that because fewer people can take the bus, fewer people can get on transit. We have a really big problem with crowding on our transit system in Toronto, which is a hugely successful system. But we've been driving our growth to our transit corridors without adding a lot of service. So it's almost impossible to get onto the subway without having someone right in front of you. We can't return to that in the in-between phase, we need social distancing in the in-between phase before a vaccine. So that being the case, we need a different approach to service, and we need different rules around how we each access and use that service. So I think we need to think in terms of now, in between, and after. One of the things that I found quite encouraging is that the Tube in London, England, has developed a disinfectant that lasts on surfaces for up to 30 days, which means any surface in the tube that they wash down with this disinfectant, whether it's a seat or a pole or a strap that you hang on to, it retains its resiliency for 30 days. I think we need to be very open to new kinds of innovations like that that are going to mitigate the risk for the in-between phase. But inevitably, transit agencies are going to have to really invest in cleaning in new ways. And to Oliver's point, the risk, of course, is that we see a backlash against using transit, which has other public health implications that are really problematic.
And I think, in fact, it's almost certain we'll see some level of backlash against public transit. I mean, you talk about the 3 stages, and I think that's an important point. Because this isn't like a war where you have a surrender ceremony and there's a day where there's a war continuing and then the next day the war is over. Even when there's a vaccine, I suspect there will be a real hesitancy for some period of time for people to be in crowded situations. And everyone will draw those lines in different ways. You know, one person might say be on the patio at the local pub is an acceptable risk, and someone else might say going to a football match is an acceptable risk. But I think there'll be a real concern around crowds. It may last for quite some time, even with a vaccine. But I think going back to one of your points from earlier, it's not just crowding, as in it's just not the same way it's not just density. Seoul has a very heavily used transit system. New York has a very heavily used transit system. Those cities' pandemic courses are completely different. It's not the subway that's making people sick. The subway may be a factor, but it's not the subway. And so I think the broader picture has to be considered in order to convince people that transit is not the problem.
Yeah, that, you know, the point you've just made there, Oliver, picks up on the point that I was trying to make in the intro about density isn't the problem. If you look at Hong Kong, Singapore, Seoul, Taiwan, very dense cities, I think you can take that same argument and put it into transit. Because cities that have really high transit use don't, by default, if transit was the problem and crowding on transit was the problem, then you would expect that cities that have more crowded and higher transit use would have higher levels of the virus. And that's simply not true. It's not true.
But we will probably see, I think we've started to see more active transportation. I mean, in Wuhan, after they lifted the lockdown, bike share use went up dramatically. Australian bike shops apparently are getting high demand. You know, bike share in Toronto last month was considerably higher than March a year ago. Now, some of those people are going to be will have temporarily shifted their behavior. Some of those people will find that cycling actually is kind of convenient and kind of nice, and maybe they kind of like it. And some of those people will then start to look around and say, but why don't I have a safe lane to ride my bike in? And so the constituency may grow, and as a result, get some more political power. So I think we will see some transportation shifts. I'm not sure where they'll go. Some will be positive. I mean, some, I think the car makers are probably salivating right now. So some will be positive and some perhaps not so much.
Well, if I could just, Pamela, just pick up on that point really quickly. The after opportunity from my perspective is that cities see that there's constituencies, there's people in their city that have now experienced the city in a different way. My daughter got out and went for a long bike ride yesterday, which she never would have done before because she doesn't feel safe, but she does feel safe because there's no cars. City leaders need to see that as an opportunity to accelerate the changes in their infrastructure.
Yeah, that's great. We're basically out of time. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. A couple of themes, though, that I've been sort of noting is, you know, that there is going to be different phases. We're likely to see some good, some bad, but the overarching ideas for the NGOs is, I really like that idea to even activate this alliance even more broadly. I think those voices are very important, and the people that that have adopted more active transportation in this period, that we may be able to give an outlet to their voice, to show, especially the decision makers who want to respond, that's their job, to respond to their constituents, and that you know, that if we engage them and the corporations and the private sector and the NGOs and government, et cetera, that if we're all giving the same message, and we can make a really solid, cohesive case based on data, that it will, you know, it has more of a probability of getting traction. So I'm going to wrap this panel up now, and just remind all the participants that it will be available on recording on the Global Alliance's website. So if you want to share that with your networks, we'll also link from Parachute's website to the Global Alliance's link. So Jennifer, Oliver, I want to sincerely thank you for the time that you've spent with us, giving us your perspectives, your expertise with this international group, and being the first panelists on the Global Alliance's series. The next one will be on mobility. We haven't announced the panelists yet, but stay tuned and watch the Global Alliance's space for that. And Parachute, on behalf of Parachute, I was pleased to host this first session, and I will sign off now and wish everyone a safe rest of the day, and to stay well. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Pamela.